Well, welcome everyone. Good evening and good afternoon. Can I now call the meeting to order and welcome you all here to the second meeting of the Bibliographical Society of 2021. Again, remotely, something which we're getting used to and gives a new dimension to our meetings. And I want today to extend a very special welcome to members of the Grolier Club. We're so pleased that you can be with us. Wonderful that we can enable this joint meeting. As it's cold today, the temperature here is 9 degrees. I've just looked up and it's 4 degrees on 47 East 60th Street. But if we can't be in our normal meeting room, then at least we can come from the warmth and comfort of our homes. And after the lecture, again, we will have our breakout rooms randomly allocated so that we can all socialize. Seems to be working very well. So do stay for that if you can, especially our friends from the Grolier. Can I just remind you at this stage to just mute yourselves, and also, if you can, to turn off your cameras at this stage because it will save bandwidth. Could I ask the Secretary, please, to read the minutes of the last meeting of the 19th of January 2021?
The third meeting of the 128th season took place online via Zoom on Tuesday, the 19th of January 2021. Professor James Raven, President, was in the chair. After the minutes of the previous meeting had been read and signed, the President introduced Mrs. Alison Walker and Ms. Alice Wickenden, who delivered a paper entitled The Sloan Printed Books Project. When the meeting was open to discussion, the following took part: the President, Professor Miriam Foote, Ms. Margaret Lane Ford, Professor Gazwan Boutros, Dr. Barbara Bienes, and Dr. Alexander Locke. The President thanked Mrs. Walker and Ms. Wickenden warmly for their paper.
Thank you. Can I just ask members to confirm that they are a correct record of the meeting? Thank you, Liam. Thank you, Miriam. Now, we're delighted to have as our speaker today, Stephen Clarke. Stephen is a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries and an Honorary Research Fellow of the University of Liverpool. He's also Chairman of Dr. Johnson's House Trust and of the Beckford Society, and he's a member of the Board of Managers of the Lewis Walpole Library at Yale University. From 2005 to 2018, he was also a trustee of Strawberry Hill, and his interests, as I'm sure you know, his research interests centre on Horace Walpole, on William Beckford, on Samuel Johnson, antiquarianism, and book history in general. He's the author of the, my word, magnificent Strawberry Hill Press and its printing house, which was published by Yale in 2011. And his most recent book is The Selected Letters of Horace Walpole in 2017, which he edited for Everyman's Library. He's currently contributing to the Book Collector and a series of essays on the libraries of early members of the club founded for Johnson. And he was curator of the 2019 exhibition at the Lewis Walpole Library, Rescuing Horace Walpole, the Achievement of W.S. Lewis. I know, of course, that some here today will have known Lefty Lewis, and even more of us will know not only of Walpole's achievements, but also know and cherish Farmington and the Lewis Walpole Library, one of the great single author collections of the 20th century, and with its exceptionally rich supporting materials. So it's with really enormous pleasure that I asked Stephen Clarke to speak to us today on Horace Walpole and W.S. Lewis, A Collector Revealed. Stephen.
Thank you. Now just 1 second. Right, Horace Walpole and W.S. Lewis. First of all, thank you very much for those kind words of introduction. In 1958, Wilmarth Sheldon Lewis, Lefty Lewis as he was known, gave a talk to a Wedgwood seminar at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. He began as follows. Ladies and gentlemen, what a delightful occasion this is. We're all collectors in this room, I assume, so I can speak freely. There's no danger or threat of any Philistine passing through those doors. And what a relief that is. As I look round, I can see in every eye that authentic light of lunacy that indicates the genuine collector. I happen to collect Horace Walpole chiefly. You collect Wedgwood, but collectors, whatever they collect, are all members of the same sodality or sorority. It makes very little difference what we collect. We understand each other from the start. And for Lewis, the start was very early. He recalled in his memoir, Collector's Progress, 1951, how at the age of 6 he collected shells at Santa Cruz, California, and his sense of outrage when he discovered that his collection had been thrown away. He then graduated to stamps. He was born in California, but went to Yale. He was class of 1918, and when at Yale, discovered the charms of the Brick Row bookshop, and was admitted to the Elizabethan Club with its legendary library. By his 20s, he was already a book collector and had started making trips to England and touring the second-hand and antiquarian bookshops there. He formed a collection of the poet John Masefield, then looked around for someone else to concentrate on. In 1922, he moved to Farmington, an elegant town of colonial and federal houses about 40 miles north of New Haven. The parents of a great school friend lived there, and he liked to say that he'd retired to Farmington at the age of 26. In 1926, he bought the Coles House, built in the 1780s for Major General Solomon Coles, who as a young man in 1776 had raised a company of volunteers and joined Washington's army. Lewis lived there as a bachelor, with the double room on the north side, which is there through to the back, serving as a library. There were parties, but despite some surviving youthful photos, it's interesting that he said of himself that he thought he'd been given the gift of perpetual middle age. The story of how he discovered Horace Walpole was retold and polished on numerous occasions. First in 1923 in Godfrey's bookshop in York, where Mr. Godfrey had persuaded him to buy a set of Jessie's George Selwyn and His Contemporaries, 1843, with, tucked into a pouch in the first volume, 33 pages of notes by Lady Louisa Stuart, the daughter of Lord Bute, writing as an old woman in 1850, but recalling the personalities of her youth, including Horace Walpole. Here's a portrait, the elderly Lady Louisa. Early the next year, Lewis viewed the Beverley Chew sale of English literature at the Anderson Galleries in New York, retreating crestfallen when told that the Walpole lots that interested him would fetch about $4,000. But the same day, he found at Scribner's different copies of the same rare items on offer for $115. Then, later that year, almost by chance, he came to call it serendipity, a word coined by Walpole. He walked into Hodgson's sale rooms in Chancery Lane in London and bought 6 letters from Walpole to the antiquarian John Pinkerton. Years later, Lewis inscribed the cover of his marked-up sale catalogue for that sale with the words, "The copy I had at the sale, and that is the foundation of my library." Lewis read Walpole's letters and became hooked. He learned more about Walpole and consulted his mentor at Yale, the great Professor Tinker. Lewis concluded that Walpole, 1717 to 97, was an important and underrated literary figure, of continuing interest to book collectors because of the productions of the Strawberry Hill Press, but generally out of fashion. Walpole was the son of the great Prime Minister, probably was the author of The Castle of Otranto, long hailed as the first Gothic novel, creator of Strawberry Hill, probably the most influential early Gothic revival house. He was a social and political chronicler, collector, aesthete, and one of the finest letter writers in the English language. Walpole had filled his Gothic creation at Strawberry Hill with his collection of portraits, china, antiquities, coins, prints, and books. By the end of his life, about 8,000 volumes were spread between a main library, in which the cases have ornate hinged Gothic arches that still survive, and 3 supplemental book rooms. The books were ordered by Walpole in the main library by their cases. The principal subjects were English antiquities and topography, books of prints in folio, French and Italian books, memoirs and biography, numismatics, English poetry, and the classics. There were contemporary plays and political tracts bound up by Walpole, books he'd extra illustrated, and many of the books were annotated by him. Here is a drawing of Muntz, by Muntz of Walpole in the library. All this had, with the rest of Walpole's collection, been dispersed in the great Strawberry Hill sale of 1842, 45 years after Walpole's death. Now Lewis, having read his way through Walpole's complete published correspondence, determined to devote his collecting energies to creating the finest Walpole library in the world, an aim which he duly achieved, his collection now forming the Lewis Walpole Library, Yale University. But Lewis from the beginning showed that he'd be more than a mere accumulator of material. He also converted himself into a scholar and an editor. In 1924, Tinker asked him to lecture to undergraduates at Yale for his Age of Johnson course, and then asked him to edit a selection of Walpole's letters suitable for that and similar courses. The result was a selection of the letters of Horace Walpole, published by Harper's and Oxford University Press in 1926, handsomely produced, and illustrated with an impressive array of manuscripts and drawings and prints that Lewis had already acquired. The following year, he produced a transcription and facsimile of a notebook of Walpole's that he'd recently bought from Dr. Rosenbach. It was designed by William Rudge and handsomely presented in its own folding box. Lewis printed an ambitious 500 copies, but all but 130 of those were lost in a fire at the printers. This project revived an initiative of Walpole's, who'd printed at Strawberry Hill 2 numbers of miscellaneous antiquities, pamphlets which reprinted antiquarian items. Lewis printed a further 13 of these between 1928 and 1940, 3 of them published commercially, the rest privately in small numbers, as gifts for his growing circle of friends in the worlds of collecting and 18th century studies. They presented unpublished manuscript material, mostly but not entirely related to Walpole, and were all elegantly produced. One of the titles with the smallest print run was The Forlorn Printer, a study of Thomas Kergate, the printer at Walpole's Strawberry Hill Press, one of only 50 copies. There were 2 or 3 of these that were just in 50 copies. Lewis also, in 1934, published his first academic article on the genesis of Strawberry Hill, published at the Metropolitan Museum Studies. From such beginnings evolved his editorship of the Yale edition of Walpole's correspondence, 1937 to 1983, whose 48 volumes were the great scholarly focus of his life. Lewis insisted that the edition include letters to as well as from Walpole, that the text be as accurate as possible, and that it be fully annotated, the text being normalized as to spelling and use of capital letters and punctuation for 20th century readers. It was Lewis's crowning achievement, though it was a collaborative effort, with Lewis as general editor working with a small team of scholars based at Stirling Memorial Library in what became known as the Walpole Factory. Lewis married Annie Burr Auchincloss in 1928. He first met her in Farmington, at Oldgate, the neighbouring 18th century house that belonged to Mrs. William S. Coles, who was the older sister of Theodore Roosevelt. She lived in something of an Edwardian time capsule. Annie Burr was Jackie Kennedy's aunt. Jackie was the stepdaughter of her elder brother Hugh. And she brought with her Auchincloss money that came from Standard Oil. Here are Lewis and Annie Burr, Newport, Rhode Island, 1927. Every inch the stylish 20s couple. They'd spend part of the summers there with Annie Burr's aunt at Hammersmith Farm, which later became famous as President Kennedy's summer White House. Lewis found the endless round of sailing and tennis of society Newport life rather unsatisfying. As you'll see, he's holding a book in the photograph. In later years, he used the smaller house, known as the Castle at Hammersmith Farm, as their summer retreat. The Lewis's marriage was very successful. Annie Burr was always supportive of her husband's great Walpolean adventure, emotionally, financially, and practically. She was an asset to him as hostess at Farmington and in his buying trips to England. Towards the end of her life, she contributed more directly to her husband's activities by cataloguing the great collection of 18th century caricatures that he was building up. The Horace Walpole's collection of these is now the finest in the world, bar only the British Museum. This is one of my favourites, which has absolutely nothing to do with the talk, but is a lovely satire on the taste and aspiration of city merchants. The Lewises had many friends. Their visitors' book is thick with names. This opening is from 1939, among the signatures are Ogden Nash, the poet, and Wyndham Ketton Kramer, the biographer of Walpole and Thomas Gray. Over 2,500 names are listed as staying one or more nights in the 40-odd years after Lewis moved into the Coles house. And Annie Burr, a keen photographer, recorded their friends, their travels, and their visitors, and it was she who made up the family's photograph albums. This one shows the Lewises with S.C. Roberts, the master of Pembroke College, Cambridge, and his wife. They're playing croquet, which was always a Coles House favourite Coles House sport, and anybody who has a fellowship at the Lewis Walpole Library will tell you that it still is. It's immediately noticeable from the archive that when Annie Burr died, the photographs of their social life just stopped. She was poised, elegant, private. There were standard poodles, but there were no children. In 1959, at the age of 57, she died of cancer. Here she is with Lewis in January 1959 in the library just 4 months before her death. Three animated, evocative images. There was the usual ghastly decline, flicker of hope, and then the end. Lewis was devastated. Let's return to the house and the collection. Here's the Coles house from the road in the 1950s. The house had remained in the Coles family until 1906, 20 years before Lewis bought it. Behind its relatively modest facade is some of the best millwork of its date in the region. Here in the entrance hall, and here in the morning room. It's from photographs taken in 1966. Lewis married Annie Burr 2 years after he bought the house, and he commissioned the fashionable New York architects Delano and Aldrich to convert it from a bachelor's period house to a family home. William Adams Delano was a member of the prominent Delano family of Massachusetts and a distant cousin of Franklin Roosevelt. He provided a wing extending from the rear of the Coles house with bedrooms and service quarters, culminating in the magnificent new library. There were also guest rooms, a garage, and a squash court. His original drawing survived, beautifully done, and the master drawing shows the floor plan. Now that is the site of the Coles house, and coming out of the back is the rear extension. There you have bedrooms, a garage, a squash court, and here is the new library. And here in more detail you see the side of the Coles house and down to the new library here. And above, you can see an interior cross-section through the new library. The Delano and Aldrich practice specialised in Beaux-Arts, Neo-Georgian and Neo-Federal styles. They also designed the Knickerbocker Club in New York and the Walters Art Gallery in Baltimore. The new library itself is a supremely fluent and confident exercise in Renaissance, that's Ren with a W. And the college library-style projecting bookcases made allowance for Lewis's growing collection. There were portraits above of Walpole and his contemporaries, looking down on Lewis's shelves of antiquarian books, their calf and gilt spines playing off the butternut woodwork. Those books are inevitably now securely kept in a climate-controlled environment, but this gives you some idea of what it must have looked like. Now, as we all know, books advance and space recedes with complete and utter inevitability. But Lewis, like Walpole, was in the privileged position of being able to deal with the problem by building a new library when he needed one. He in fact built 2 further libraries at the back of the house, and the squash court was in due course converted to shelving for reference books. Interestingly, these weren't fitted out as elegant country house style libraries, but as functional modern spaces. This is the East Library, with metal racking, rolling metal shelves, and card index drawers. You'll see one strange note, which is the lantern. This is the extraordinary Gothic creation of Walpole's designer friend Richard Bentley, which hung over the stairs at Strawberry Hill. It was rescued by Lewis in 1935 from a lumber room at Sudeley Castle in Gloucestershire, where it had been thrown out by the owner's wife. It followed Lewis back to Farmington, but there it found no more favour with Annie Burr than it had with the chatelaine of Sudeley, and so was relegated to this library come office. And here is Lewis at work in the North Library. Scholarship and editing in the 1950s, conducted in a three-piece tweed suit and pocket handkerchief. The key elements of Lewis's collecting strategy were determination, organisation, and charm. He introduced himself to the leading booksellers of London, learned to negotiate his way through the auction houses, acquired the skills of researching provenance from experts such as Seymour de Ricci, and applied himself to reassembling Walpole's library and the letters he'd written. Despite Walpole's collection having been long dispersed, it was extraordinarily well documented. First by Walpole himself, in his manuscript library catalogue of 1763. It was then at Walton Hall in Norfolk, and now this is in the Getty collection at Wormsley. Secondly, Walpole's own account of the collection that is his description of Strawberry Hill. And thirdly, in the auction sale catalogue of 1842. This was compiled by the flamboyant auctioneer George Robbins, on whom Robin Myers has written. Robbins recorded the collection room by room and the library shelf by shelf. And this record of the placement of the books is underpinned by Walpole's own shelf marks, locating the books in the main library from Bay A, to the right of the chimneypiece, to Bay M, and consisting of bay number, shelf number counting from the bottom, and position on the shelf counting from the left. So, this copy of Birch's edition of Francis Bacon's Letters, 1763, the end paper with one of Walpole's plates and the shelf mark A434. So looking at the library, Bay A, fourth shelf from the bottom, 37th from the left, and there is where it would have been. Lewis's successes with booksellers and auctions were a matter of application and money, though remarkably, he managed not significantly to push up prices against himself. John Carter noted how this was secured by a combination of resolution and finesse, and the ability to attract the goodwill of the book trade. Lewis benefited from the low prices of the recession. Quote, "The surviving collectors of the 30s look back to that time as a lost paradise," he declared. And he was certainly alert to the opportunities, as in 1939, which was when war was declared. That day, he agreed with the London dealer Sabin a price of $500 for Walpole's copy of the Mezzotint of Reynolds after Reynolds, of Walpole's great nieces, the three ladies Waldegrave. Sabin had previously been asking 2,000 guineas for it. But Lewis also developed and spread the concept that Walpoleana properly belonged at Farmington. It was essential for the Yale edition of Walpole's correspondence that all letters to and from Walpole that could be traced should be examined, at the very least photocopied with the owner's permission, and if at all possible, secured for Farmington. By 1940, Lewis had decided that he'd leave his collection to Yale, and it had begun to acquire a quasi-institutional status, still very much a private library, but also the engine for the scholarly activity of the Yale edition, the most comprehensive collection of Walpoleana in the world, dedicated to current scholarship, but with a secure institutional future. Lewis epitomizes that possibly now extinct breed, the scholar collector. As we've seen, as an undergraduate at Yale, he'd sat at the feet of Professor Tinker, and Tinker had used his extensive collection of English literature as a teaching aid to inspire his students, for which see the 500 pages of the Tinker Library Catalogue, edited after Tinker's death by Robert Metzdorf. Collecting was rife among Yale staff. Metzdorf, who worked at Yale's Sterling Library, collected Thackeray. James T. Babb was the university librarian. He collected William Beckford. Fritz Leibert, the first director of the Beinecke Library, collected Johnson and Austin Dobson. Donald Gallup, curator of the Yale Collection of American Literature, of course collected T.S. Eliot Pound and others. James Osborne, affiliated to the faculty, but independently wealthy and only technically on the payroll, he was what was known as a $1 a year man, founded the Osborne collection of manuscript material, which is now one of the great glories of the Beinecke Library. And all this is just at Yale in the mid-20th century. These were all people Lewis knew, and many of them, like Lewis, left their collections to Yale. This was his academic and cultural milieu. As for the boundless reference material that supported the collection and the edition, the essential issue in a pre-computer age was information retention and recovery. The result was over 100 cross-referenced card index files, with some 850,000 index cards, covering everything from Walpole's correspondence, as here, and in more detail here, indexes of tradesmen and auction sales and foreign diplomats, to books that Walpole had owned or annotated or even referred to, and a myriad of others. There was a diurnal consisting of 12 substantial metal-bound lever arch files listing Walpole's recorded activities of each day of his adult life, where he was, whom he met, and what letters he wrote. Here are the entries for 4 days in December 1765, when he was in Paris. When it came to cataloguing the prints, the project that Annie Bird initiated, by the end of Lewis's life, there were 60,000 index cards, with up to 60 or so entries for a single print. Lewis recalled how a curator at Winterthur had a query about the hanging of curtains. What evidence was there that curtains hung down to the floor in the 18th century? The relevant card index at the Coles House listed under the entry curtains some 80 different prints showing 18th century curtains in situ, giving the curator his answer. What of other owners of Walpole material? They were listed in the Black Books, as they were known. These recorded all current owners of Walpoleana, gleaned by Lewis and his assistants from poring over auction sale catalogues and inventories. Some were institutional owners, some were private, but none was safe from an approach from the charming, urbane, but determined Mr. Lewis. He developed the skills of ingratiating himself with the English gentry. No, in fact, that's the wrong way of putting it. He had great natural, if rather patrician charm and infectious enthusiasm, and he was as comfortable staying as a weekend guest in a grand English country house as he was in a Cambridge College common room or at a Yale boardroom. What he did do was urge hesitant owners that in an uncertain world, his collection at Farmington, destined for Yale, was the safe and proper haven for their often inherited treasures. He even succeeded in charming some items out of public institutions by offering them something that was much more central to their collections than the odd disregarded piece of Walpoleana they happened to hold. This page of the Black Books shows Lewis's success in this way with no less than the Folger Shakespeare Library, to whom he gave corrected proof sheets that he'd bought of the Stevens and Reed edition of Shakespeare in exchange for some plays that Walpole had bound up. And he managed to build up such a relationship with the director that when he realized they had further plays of Walpole Providence, he persuaded them to let him buy them, which gave the Folger the funds to buy an 18th century copy of the Chandos portrait of Shakespeare. There were similar successes at Michigan, Ann Arbor, and the University of Illinois. Altogether, Lewis acquired material from 19 US institutions and 4 British. These organizational skills were recognized in the Second World War, when Lewis worked for 2 years from 1941 as chief of the newly created Central Information Division in what became the Office of Strategic Services. He was one of that generation of Yale personnel that worked in intelligence in Washington during the war. In Lewis's case, he was adapting for government use the information storage and retrieval systems he developed for his collecting and editing. He recalled with pride that having established and bedded down their systems, the first question they were asked was what was the electrical current used in Suriname, which they answered readily, and their filing and indexing systems became a model for other Washington departments to copy. Lewis was adept at telling stories of his collecting triumphs and disasters, which is what makes Collector's Progress such a delightful book, and a contrast to the autobiography he wrote later in his life, One Man's Education, 1967. Without the watchful eye of Annie Bird, it's more reflective, much more psychologically revealing, and veers towards the portentous. It's also written in the third person, referring to himself at different stages of his life as Louis, Lefty, and Lewis. 488 pages of Iliism, which is not recommended. Collector's Progress recounts such encounters as his meeting with the splendid Edwardian eccentric Richard Bentley, heir to the publishing house, and the elderly English family at whose country house Lewis found when dressing for formal dinner that he'd only packed 2 left shoes, one of them a golf shoe. It also tells of quixotic collecting quests like the Theatre of George III, the series of contemporary plays that Walpole had bound up in 58 volumes. Those volumes had been disbound and some of the plays already sold when Lewis discovered the remaining 130 at Pickering and Chatto's shop in the West End. Walpole had written the names of the plays on the inside cover of each binding, as here. And Lewis bought the remaining plays annotated by Walpole and all the bindings, and devoted himself to tracing the buyers of the plays that had already been sold, hence his negotiations with the Folger. But how to trace those disbound plays which Walpole hadn't annotated, where Walpole's copy would be indistinguishable from any other disbound copy? Well, not quite indistinguishable. By checking the colour of staining of the edges of the disbound plays and the angle of the foredges from where in the book it had been bound, Lewis recovered another 65 plays from Pickering's alone. Ultimately, he managed to reassemble 350 of the plays, about 2/3 of the collection, and almost 4/5 of the bindings. This is collecting at its most focused. One collecting triumph that Lewis did not recount was his acquisition of the heart of the Waldegrave's family collection of Walpole books and manuscripts, partly inherited and partly acquired in the 19th century. It was by far the most important Walpole collection in private hands. Here's a selection, a mixture of bound manuscripts and extra illustrated and annotated books. The copies in red morocco with green labels had been bound up for Walpole's deputy Grosvenor Bedford, while this volume is an oblong folio of architectural drawings of Strawberry Hill and elsewhere by John Shute, of enormous significance for the study of the early Gothic revival. The most important item was the 6 bound volumes of the transcripts by Walpole and his secretary of Walpole's letters to Horace Mann, his greatest correspondence. Original letters have long been lost, so this is the essential text. There were Walpole's commonplace books. There was a trove of manuscripts. There were numerous images of Strawberry Hill and much else besides. It's a story that tells much about Lewis's charm and his obsessional commitment. And it's a story that was told by Mary Waldegrave in a thoroughly engaging piece in the Book Collector after Lewis's death. She celebrated the friendship that she and her husband Geoffrey, 12th Earl Waldegrave, shared with Lewis. Here they are. And here's the family home they were living in before the war, Chewton Priory in Somerset. Lord Waldegrave later became a minister in Macmillan's government. And extraordinarily, the friendship not only survived, but even deepened after Lewis descended for the kill. Though Mary Waldegrave did comment that, quote, "It would not be out of all reason to say this was banditry, this turning of the screw was pretty unscrupulous," and so indeed it was. What I found at the Lewis Walpole Library at Farmington were 3 folders preserved by Lewis, the entire correspondence between him and the Waldegraves from 1931, when they first made contact, until his death in 1979, charting his introduction to them, their developing relationship, and their clear enjoyment of his company. Lewis made an unsuccessful attempt to buy the Walpole material from them in 1937. He was happy to pay the market price, but prices were depressed and they had no need to sell. But after the rigours endured by the Waldegraves during the war, Lewis's generosity, which was never convincingly unconditional, managed to impose a sense of moral obligation that the material belonged at Farmington, where it would serve the Yale edition and the scholarly community. At length, in 1948, 17 years after gaining their friendship, Lewis collected. He and Annie Burr stayed with the Waldegraves in Somerset for the weekend. After sorting out and boxing up the long yearned-for treasure, as Mary put it, quote, Lefty took his place in the car, box at his feet, and a smile of bliss on his face. Away they went, and the cheque, still of modest dimensions, arrived next day. Lewis, in fact, returned to London and went straight to Sotheby's to have the material valued. Anthony Hobson carried out the valuation at £1,759, the equivalent today of about £64,500. The cheque was no doubt sent immediately, as Lewis was all too happy to pay the market value. The underlying issue was rather the fact that the Waldegraves were burdened by a sense of obligation to sell that Lewis had only encouraged. Mary Waldegrave wrote that despite this, their friendship survived, and that Lewis never asked for more. But the correspondence at Farmington shows that when the trove arrived, Lewis wrote to Mary asking if he could buy 3 more Walpole letters, 2 manuscripts, 7 books from Walpole's library, and 4 detached pieces that he thought had been omitted in error. Mary replied that the sale of family heirlooms had been too upsetting for her husband, and she wasn't prepared to reopen the wound. She was herself an archivist and a scholar manqué, untroubled by the collecting gene, and she could see the point of Lewis's grand design. Back in 1937, her husband had realised the tension between Lewis, the scholarly editor, and Lewis, the collector, and told him that while the Waldegraves would help Lewis as editor attain his scholarly first, they were not prepared to assist him in getting a double first in scholarship and collecting. Needless to say, Lewis collected both. That's the story, with further twists and turns, that I've told in a book that the Book Collector are issuing, pandemic permitting, this October. Reading the Waldegrave correspondence and thinking about Lewis, devoting his entire adult life to collecting and editing one 18th century figure, it's hard to deny the issue of obsession. He even at one stage devoted a room at Farmington to what he aptly called Lewis's Folly, which was a collection of 18th century books published between 1751 and 1800, of which the British Museum did not have copies. Obsession comes at a cost, though. It wasn't a private passion, the solitary miser gloating over his hoard. The whole point about Lewis's collection was that it fed scholarship, providing the raw materials for the Yale edition. But still, the single-mindedness of the collecting, the overpowering detail of those black books listing all and any possible owners that might be approached, those hundreds of thousands of index cards, year after year, decade after decade, devoted to running to earth any stray piece of Walpoleana he could find. These show a man powered by compelling forces. In a commemorative tribute after Lewis's death, Fritz Leibert, a long-standing friend, did mention how in conversation with Lewis, the topic would at any time unpredictably, but inevitably, lurch back to the subject of Horace Walpole. When in 2019 I prepared an exhibition on Lewis at the Lewis Walpole Library, I was inevitably interested in the tension between this obsessional quality and the magnificent collection and magisterial Yale edition that came out of it. One exhibit in particular epitomised this tension for me. It's a painting from 1950 by a New York artist, Adrian Lamb. It shows Lewis standing behind Walpole under a tree in a recreation of a drawing by Richard Bentley, which was also in the exhibition. It is the Bentley drawing with Walpole between 2 philosophers, the tree behind, and over to the left you see Strawberry Hill. In the painting, it's Lewis behind, staring not at Strawberry Hill, but at the Coles house and the new library, with an extraordinary purposeful look on Lewis's face. The painting was commissioned by a New York art dealer of whom Lewis was a good customer, I believe with assistance from Annie Burr, but Lewis hated it and refused to have it hung in the house. It was discovered in an attic after his death, and you can see from the label at the back the circumstances. I did hesitate about using it in the exhibition, as I didn't want to be disrespectful, and I was trying to celebrate Lewis's achievement. But the painting unintentionally absolutely captures that oddness, the raw nerve of Lewis's devotion to Walpole, that sense of Lewis losing his identity in Walpole, which I'm sure is why he so disliked it. Sorry. On a lighter note, another exhibit I use provides a different example of the same obsessional quality. In 1940, Lewis and Annie Burr gave a mobile canteen to Britain for use in the war, serving tea to fire wardens during the Blitz at Manchester. Here it is. The plaque on the side of the vehicle shows it was given by WSL and ABL, but then in larger letters records that it was given, quote, in memory of Horace Walpole. I like to think of it as Walpole's contribution to the war effort. Lewis acknowledged in later life that, quote, for 30 years and more, he felt that anyone who criticised Walpole was criticising him. And he certainly felt he knew Walpole so intimately that he could divine what he would or wouldn't have thought on any specific occasion. Just look at this photo. It was taken at an exhibition held in 1973 at Hertford College, celebrating the 40th anniversary of the founding of the Yale edition. And it shows Lewis looking at the portrait of Walpole by Alan Ramsay, which Lewis owned. Lewis's eyes are locked into Walpole's eyes. There's the hint of a smile on Lewis's face, but also a look almost of longing. By way of contrast, look at this image of Paul Mellon, standing by one of the portrait sculptures in his collection at the Yale Centre for British Art. Wryly observant, quizzical, his own man. And here's another collector, Norton Simon, founder of the Norton Simon Museum at Pasadena, with his prize painting, Rembrandt's portrait of his son Titus. This is completely psychologically uncomplicated. The collector isn't even engaging with his treasure. There's the cat and there's the cream. The photo of Lewis has much more psychological depth. The new library at Farmington, and by the way, that's a portrait of Annie Burr over the fireplace. The new library at Farmington is another example of what I mean. Lewis recorded that when in 1929 the room was finished, all those handsome shelves just waiting to be filled with Lewis's collection that must have been bursting out of the Coles house, Lewis found that he could hardly bear to enter the room. He was oppressed with the idea that Lewis and Farmington were being subsumed by Walpole and Strawberry Hill and had to seek therapy. But we should put these issues in context. Lewis had carved a career and a reputation for himself. He'd assembled unquestionably the finest Walpole collection in the world. He'd acquired some 3,000 original letters to and from Walpole. He'd traced about half of Walpole's collection of about 8,000 books from Strawberry Hill, Walpole's own copies, and he'd acquired 80% of the ones he'd traced. The manuscript holdings at Farmington are simply extraordinary, not just the range and depth of the Walpole material, but also other manuscript collections, such as the Hanbury-Williams papers and the Grenville papers. There's a vast assemblage of supporting 18th century printed material, much of it distinguished by annotation, extra illustration, or simple rarity. And there's the wonderful collection of caricatures that I've mentioned. Starting off with a BA from Yale, Lewis was by the end of his life showered with honorary degrees. The Yale edition was widely hailed as painstaking and exemplary triumph of scholarship. The first two volumes were published in 1937, the final index volumes in 1983, 50 years after Yale had taken the step of appointing Lewis an honorary research fellow and given him an office in Stirling Library and one assistant. Lewis didn't live to see the last volumes in print. He died in 1979, but he'd seen them in preparation, and with the finishing post in sight, he wrote a typically elegant preface to the last volumes of miscellaneous correspondence. There was a succession of laudatory reviews over the years, and the Yale Walpole set standards for other major editions issued by Yale and other university presses from the mid-20th century. The Yale edition of Samuel Johnson's works and the Boswell papers, and some of the Founding Fathers papers, such as the Franklin edition. Walpole, Boswell, and Franklin all came out of neighbouring offices in Stirling Library. The key elements of the Yale Walpole were accuracy of text, based wherever possible on Lewis tracing the original manuscripts, and extensive annotation, explaining all the passing references in the letters. Lewis employed specific editors for the different volumes, but he acted as general editor and insisted on proofing the footnotes, which are exercises in artistry and conciseness. The edition was completed by a monumental index compiled by Lewis's editor-in-chief and long-standing assistant, Warren Hunting Smith. It has over 250,000 entries, contained in 1,000 pages over 5 volumes, and has become a standard reference tool for the British 18th century. The edition also set standards in terms of timeliness and delivery. Lewis drove the edition devotedly, encouraging his staff, from whom he expected the same dedication and loyalty for the project as he felt himself, hunting for relevant manuscript material, reading the proofs, writing introductions, and helping to publicise the project to the world. He'd originally thought that his edition would appeal to what used to be known as the intelligent general reader, with a healthy sprinkling of millionaires and landed gentry and the like. The early volumes had a list of subscribers, starting with the British king or queen and progressing through the nobility. A snob sheet. When it became apparent that the vast majority of buyers were in fact American colleges, the snob sheet was quietly dropped. He even had a wall chart recording the sales state by state over the United States. Across the bottom is the list of sales abroad. Lewis also played a major role at Yale, where he was on the corporation for a quarter of a century, as well as serving on numerous other boards and organisations. There's a good account of life in the Coles house during the war, when Annie Burr was still very much alive. It comes from Lord Waldegrave, who'd been posted to Washington and visited Farmington when on leave in the beginning of 1945. He reported to his wife as follows: "It's difficult to describe left in his own house. He's much older, white-haired and bent with arthritis. He's half don, half squire, with an immense fund of general erudition and a very quick mind. Gosh, it's comfortable here, exactly like a pre-war English country house. Nice, quiet English servants, tons of room everywhere, lots of rooms where you can sit and read or write, and no one does anything to bother anyone else." The staff consisted of Ross, the butler, who'd previously been butler to the Duke of Buccleuch, which would have quietly appealed to Lewis, and his wife, who was the cook. Donald Gallup's memoirs have a nice story of Gallup taking T.S. Eliot up to Farmington, where Eliot expressed himself delighted to meet Mr. Lewis, only to find he was addressing the suitably deferential Ross. After Ross and his wife returned to Scotland in 1954, there was a cook and 2 maids who supported Lewis after Annie Burr's death. He was also assisted by Catherine Jestin, who played a major role after his death in the transition from private library to institutional library. Then there was also Bill Day, the gardener and chauffeur. When Day found some Indian artifacts in the garden, there were archaeological digs, and the objects discovered were displayed in a little building there. In later years, Lewis's meetings with the Walpole edition editors would tend to take place over lunch at the Coles house, there rather than at New Haven, and they sound rather formal occasions. Towards the end of his life, I rather suspect that the Coles house became something of a time capsule, as Oldgate had been when young Lewis had met his wife there back in the distant 1920s. He found the youth culture of the late 60s and 70s alien, and was concerned to notice that at the end of his life, Walpole material was much harder to find, and there seemed to be as much interest in the Indian artifact that Bill Day had found as in Horace Walpole in the 18th century. But in conclusion, he had the abiding vision of Yale at Farmington, of the Coles house as a centre for 18th century studies, a retreat where academics could tease out the potential and the riches of his collection. His insistence on keeping the collection together there rather than merging it into Yale's libraries in New Haven has been justified 100-fold. The importance and coherence of individual collections is of course now widely recognised, and with its modern reading room and state-of-the-art facilities, its active fellowship programme and its profile at Yale and in the broader scholarly world, the Lewis Walpole Library, Yale in Farmington, amply fulfills Lewis's vision. Thank you very much.